Okay, everybody, this is future me. So I just finished editing the video for Raidable Bases, which you're about to watch here in a second. I just wanted to get a couple of things out of the way before you guys start watching the actual video. If you're planning on using Raidable Bases on one of your servers, make sure you go over the entire documentation before you even try to install anything. And of course, now that this video is available, I want you to watch this entire video before you start installing anything. Make sure you have a good grasp on everything that's going on before you start doing anything. It's going to save you a lot of trouble in the long run. It's going to save you a lot of frustration and a lot of time. Nivex has spent an awful lot of time creating the documentation that goes along with the plugin. So make sure you reference that, make sure you reference the video. And of course, there's always going to be some trial and error involved, but just work through the processes. You'll get this plugin. I promise you, you will. Anyways, it's a long one. I apologize for that, but there's a ton of information that I had to get across to you guys. So I hope you guys enjoy the video, and I hope that it's helpful to at least some people. Alright everybody, so today's video starts out with a bit of a story. So back in June of 2020, I decided that I was going to do a video on Raidable Bases. The mistake I made at the time was that I did not contact Nivex to see if it was okay to do a video on one of his plugins. And secondly, I didn't ask him for help on that plugin. So a couple of things happened as a result of that. A, I didn't get the information across to you guys in a manner that was actually helpful to you. Now granted, a lot of people watched that video, a lot of people took enough information out of it to make the plugin work for themselves. However, even I had some of the details wrong, and I felt like I was actually misinforming people by having that video out there. So I marked that video as outdated. Nivex has also gone through and completely reconfigured the plugin itself, so now it functions completely differently. So today's video, we're going to go over the new version of Raidable Bases. I'm going to try and work it out so that I answer everyone's questions, or at least the questions that I get asked most often. But this time around, I actually asked Nivex's permission to do a video on Raidable Bases, and I was able to collaborate with him and actually get together, and we were on a Discord call for about 2 hours, and we went over all of the details, or at least all of the details that he felt that you guys needed to know. Of course, he gets just as many questions about Raidable Bases as I do. In fact, he probably gets way more, being that he's the author of the plugin. So that's the backstory. So let's get into Raidable Bases version 1.6.6, which is current at the time of the recording this video, which is February 10th, 2021. Hey everybody, welcome back to Rust Admin Academy, where I teach you guys the very best tips and tricks to owning and operating a successful Rust server. On this channel, I do a lot of plugin reviews and tutorials to hopefully show you guys the ins and the outs of the different things that you can do on your island to create better gameplay for your players or better quality of life for you as an admin. So if you're brand new to the channel, consider subscribing so that you stay up to date on everything that we're working on. And of course, remember to hit that notification bell so that you get notified every time I upload a new video. I put out a brand new video every Friday at 5 p.m. Mountain Time. So like I said in the intro of the video, I did actually get together with Nivex, and we had a really great conversation about Raidable Bases. And he was very candid with me about his opinions and his thoughts about Raidable Bases. It's a very complex plugin, and it is probably, to be honest with you, it's probably one of the most difficult plugins I've ever come across. And using Nivex's own words, he says this plugin is a pain in the ass. So my goal here today is to hopefully show you guys a couple of the details that you need to know so that you can get this plugin up and running for yourself. There are way too many details in this plugin for me to go over every single one of them, as you're going to see in a couple of minutes here. I'll show you the config files. And yes, I say configuration files, plural, more than one, because there is more than one configuration file. So if we have a look at the Raidable Bases page on the Umod website, oh, by the way, I'll put a link to this in the video description down below, so make sure you check that out. So if we have a look here, you can see that the only dependency that Raidable Bases actually requires you to have on your server is the CopyPaste plugin. The CopyPaste plugin is what Raidable Bases actually uses to place your base on the map. So that all being said, there's a little bit of prerequisite work that you have to do in order to make this work. You have to have a couple of bases pre-made or pre-installed on your server before you can actually make Raidable Bases work. Now, I've done videos in the past showing you guys that you can actually download and then import bases from the Steam Workshop using a program called Fortify. I'll put a link to that right here, right above my head right now, but don't go watch that just yet. Only go watch that video if you're actually going to be downloading videos from the Steam Workshop. If you're just looking for base ideas, the Steam Workshop is a great place to get bases from, but I don't suggest that you actually use those bases. You can, there's nothing wrong with that, but I would suggest downloading them, figuring out what the base is all about, and then design your own base based off of that design. As you can see here, I've gone through and I've made a couple of bases just for this video alone, so you wouldn't necessarily use these bases themselves, but you definitely could use something similar. So whether you're using Fortified to import bases into your server or you're actually creating your own, you just need to validate that you have those base designs in your copy paste folder. So Raidable Bases is actually going to call on copy paste to place the bases that you've now designed. So if we go into our data folder, we go into the copy paste folder right there. As you can see there, I've pre-built 3 different bases. I've just called them easy base, medium base, and hard base. You can name these bases whatever you want. I suggest not having any spaces in any of these names, but Nivex has actually informed me that you can actually use spaces in these names as long as when you call on them later, you put the name in quotations. You'll see what I mean. Don't worry. If you've never seen any of this stuff before, this is going to seem a little bit complicated, but don't worry. It's all going to make sense later. So your homework before you even try to install Raidable Bases onto your server is make sure you have copy paste and make sure you have a couple of bases that we can use. And then of course, make sure those bases are actually in your copy paste folder. All right, clear as mud, right? Let's move on. Okay, so now I've successfully installed Raidable Bases onto my server, and now we can actually get into the nitty-gritty of all of this. Okay, so first things first, as always, let's go over the permissions first. So today I'm using Permissions Manager, and if you've never seen my tutorial on how to actually deal with permissions, I highly suggest you go and watch it. It's going to change your life. It's going to make permission management so much easier. You definitely want to have something like this in order to manage your permissions instead of manually entering them each time for every single plugin. So let's go into Raidable Bases, and these are the permissions that are available for this plugin. Now, directly from Nivex, he says that none of these permissions are actually required in game, meaning that you can do everything from the console, which is actually his preferred method. I myself, I prefer to use chat commands in game, but I have actually found it for myself that it is actually a little bit easier just doing things on the console. So for demonstration purposes, I'm actually not going to grant any of these permissions to myself or anybody else in this server. I highly encourage you to go over the documentation of the permissions that Nivex has written out on the Umod website. It goes over each permission individually, telling you what each one does. I'm gonna bring your attention to the one at the very top here called allow. That doesn't make it so that your players are allowed to actually access Raidable Bases. This does is it actually gives them the ability to spawn Raidable Bases. So you don't want your default group or VIP groups or anything like that. You don't want anyone to have any of these permissions. The one caveat to that is you can actually have a VIP cooldown right here. So if you do have a VIP cooldown set up on your server, then of course you would want to grant this permission to your VIPs, but nothing else is necessary to operate this plugin. So first things first, where is Raidable Bases actually going to plop these bases? So to find that out, we can actually use a command. It is called RB space grid. Looks just like this. And then when you hit enter, you'll see that domes are then built around all of the monuments. And then you can see all of these green X's that generated up all over the place. Each one of those green X's is a potential location for a base to spawn. The plugin is going to decide, is there enough room? Is it far enough away from a monument? Basically just, is it an acceptable place to spawn a base? So if you downloaded and installed Raidable Bases onto your server and you went looking around into your configuration files and your data files, you're going to notice a couple of things. We're going to address all that stuff right now, because if you compare this version of Raidable Bases to the one that I covered last June in 2020, it is drastically different. Things have changed a lot. So the first things first, I would suggest that we go into the configuration file and then let's go into Raidable Bases. So we're just going to edit this Raidable Bases. So now the way to look at this is the configuration file that resides inside the configuration folder controls everything that has anything to do with Raidable Bases as an umbrella. It will then be broken down into different difficulty categories, but we're going to get into that in just a second. Just remember the RaidableBases.json that resides in the configuration file controls everything about the plugin. So this configuration file is literally 371 lines long by default. So obviously I can't go over every single detail, but I will point out a couple of things that Nivex and I both decided it was important information that you guys should know. Not that there's anything in here that's not important, but when referring to the questions that him and I have both received about this plugin, we felt that there are a couple of details that we need to point out. Starting on line 31, you're going to start seeing things broken down by difficulty level and days of the week. So yes, we can decide, do you only want to have easy raids available on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday? You can configure that here in this section. So you can decide which difficulty levels you will have available for raiding on which days of the week. If you don't care about any of that, just leave all of these set to true and all levels will spawn on every day of the week. So this is the first section that I'd like to bring your attention to. This is basically us telling the plugin where we want certain items to end up. So while yes, the plugin will try to put everything into boxes, there are other locations where things can go. So like we can make it so that the plugin automatically puts all of the resources on the loot tables that we have yet to define. We can make it so that all of the resources automatically go into the TC. We can make it so that cookable items automatically go into barbecues. We can make it so that all other food goes into fridges if there's a fridge available and if there's an oven available inside the base that we've now placed. So getting into the buyable raids, yes, you can set it up so that players or teams of players can actually buy different raids, which will basically lock that raid to that person for the entirety of the raid. Now, does that mean that somebody can come along and kill them? Yes, absolutely. Can they take over the raid? Yes, absolutely. There are a couple of caveats to that in a PvP versus a PvE server. There are controls that will allow it so that you can, like, so let's say you have a PvE server, which means there's no player to player fighting at all. You can make it so that during raids, when somebody is raiding one of these raidable bases, it becomes a PvP zone, which then of course makes it so that players can kill each other and take over the raid for themselves. That's this section right here. So convert PvE to PvP, true or false, or vice versa, true or false. So the maintained events, this is essentially what most people are looking for. They aren't necessarily looking for the buyable raids. Most people are looking for the maintained raidable bases or the scheduled raidable bases. Me personally, I just want to have, X number of bases available for raids on my server at any given time. So this section right here that you're looking at, this is where you're going to define what those maintained raidable bases actually look like. So always maintain max events. For demonstration purposes, I'm going to change that to true. You can decide if that works on your server or not. None of the PvE versus PvP stuff actually applies in a demonstration type of scenario, but if you are running a PvE type server, of course this information is going to be important to you. I'm not skipping over this because it's not important. I'm skipping over it just in the interest of time. So again, I'm going to refer you back to the documentation on the Umod site that Nivex has written up for you. It goes over all of this stuff in extreme detail. Minimum players required online. By default, this is set to 1. You can make it whatever you want. Let's say you want to set it up so that 10 players have to be online before the plugin will actually start spawning bases. You simply change this to a 10 right there, and that's how that's done. For demonstration purposes, I'm going to leave this at 1 because I'm the only person on this test server. And then max maintained events. Now, Nivex suggests that you don't have like 100 of these. You have to consider that each one of these bases that this plugin is actually going to spawn does take resources away from your server. So if you're spawning bases with a ton of turrets or just a ton of entities by itself, that's all going to take away from the resources available for your server. I want to make a good demonstration, so I'm going to make this a crazy number. Let's say that we want to maintain 100 bases on our server at all times. Spawn bases X distance apart. That's how much space is in between each one of the bases. By default, this is set to 100. Let's change this to 50. I'm hoping that we're going to actually get a little conglomerate, a little village of a bunch of raidable bases all together. Maybe it's going to break the plugin. Maybe it's going to break my server. I don't know. We'll see. Spawns database file. Okay, so this is an important section that I need everyone to pay attention to. So you remember at the beginning when I did RB space grid, that shows all of the available locations all over the map where the plugin can actually spawn bases. Let's say you don't want to use that. Let's say you want to specify specific locations all over your map where raidable bases can only put bases on those locations. You would then get into a plugin called Spawns Database, which then gives you the ability to create different spawn locations all over your map. You can save that into a database or a file, and then you can tell raidable bases to use that file in order to decide where it's going to spawn those bases. This doesn't apply to most people, but functionality is there. If you want to do it, you can specify where this plugin is going to spawn bases. The manual event section is reserved just for owners or moderators of your server because there is a command where we can manually spawn in raidable bases, and this is the parameters that determine how that functionality is actually going to work. So you can have maxes, you can have specific locations if you're using Spawns Database. Same thing applies as maintained events, but these are actually activated by using an in-game command. The next section is scheduled events. So the difference between scheduled events and maintained events is just going to maintain X number of raidable bases all over the map, whereas scheduled events is going to spawn bases over time, depending on the time parameters that we're about to put into this config. So by default, this is set to false. We're going to change this to true. Again, with the converting PvE to PvP, not that it's not important, but we're not covering that in this video. What's the minimum amount of time that you want the plugin to wait before it spawns an event? By default, this is set to 3600 100 seconds, and then the maximum is set to 7200 seconds. But for demonstration purposes, we're going to speed things up a little bit. So we're going to change this to every 30 seconds and every 60 seconds. Therefore, between every 30 and 60 seconds, Raidable Bases is going to spawn another base somewhere on the map. And how many scheduled events do we want to have? Let's do 100. Minimum players online, we're going to leave that at 1. And how much distance do we want to have between each one of these bases? Let's change this to 50. And again, we have the ability to use Spawn's database if we so chose. So the next section is dealing with the actual purchasing of raids. So you can actually use economics, which is like Rust's in-game dollars, or you can use server rewards, which is known as RP, to purchase different difficulty levels of Raidable Bases, providing, of course, that we've made it possible inside the configuration file to actually buy raids. Because we're not getting into the specifics of that on this video, I actually left buyable raids at false, so none of this actually matters for today's video. However, this section is where you determine how much each one of those raids is going to cost based on their level of difficulty. Now, you're going to see a line here, right here. I'm going to point it out to you. I'm going to highlight it right here. This Raidable Bases, and then you're going to see this building section right here with brackets, which looks like it's waiting for information from you. Guess what? It's not. Don't touch this. Don't try to put any information in there. Just leave this exactly the way you see it right now. Otherwise, you're going to break the plugin. On line 276, you're going to see a line there that says use day of the week loot. Now, granted, we haven't created any loot tables, so that doesn't mean anything right now. However, you can actually control what loot is available on what day of the week. So let's say you want to have less loot available on Monday when maybe your server is a little bit slower. You can do that. We're going to get into all that once we start dealing with the loot tables though. So don't worry about it right now. But this right here, if you do want to have different loot available on different days of the week, you have to toggle this to true. If you don't want to use different loot tables for different days of the week, just leave it at false. And again, same thing here. You're going to see a bunch of open and closed brackets. It looks like it's waiting for information from you. It's not, so don't try to put anything in there. Starting at line 346, we're basically deciding how different traps are going to work inside of our Raidable Bases. Do we want infinite ammo? Yes or no? If we don't want infinite ammo, how much ammo do we want to actually have in each one of the traps? Tesla coils, we can have Tesla coils set up in our Raidable Bases. Do we require that they have power, true or false? And that's basically going to sum up all of the information that I'm going to go over for that configuration file, the umbrella configuration file for Raidable Bases. We're going to get into the specifics in just a second. So for right now, let's just save this. We're not going to reload the plugin yet because it doesn't really matter. We haven't done anything yet except changed a couple of features inside the config. So the next step is actually telling Raidable Bases which bases we want to use so that it can spawn those different bases in. So this, of course, is referring back to the copy paste folder that I was talking about at the very beginning. So we need to tell the plugin which base names we actually want to use for which difficulty levels. So when it comes time to actually start adding the bases to Raidable Bases, we need to decide which bases we're actually going to use for each difficulty level. So if you have a bunch of bases that you want to be really easy raids, we're going to put those in the easy category. Same thing goes with medium, hard, expert, and nightmare level Raidable Bases. So obviously, as the difficulty level increases, you probably want to increase the raid difficulty level of each one of those bases, i.e. the size of them, the complexity of the build, etc., etc. For my demonstration, I only have 3 really simple bases. I have them named as easy, medium, and hard. We're going to use all 3 of those bases in all of the difficulty levels of Raidable Bases. So even though we have 3 really easy looking bases to raid, you're going to see them in all of the difficulty levels going forward. So as you can see there, I've started to put in a command into my server console. So that command is rb.config and add, because we're adding bases to the different profiles. Don't worry about profiles. We're going to get into that in just a second. So we're adding base names to the easy bases profile, and we're going to add easy base 001, medium base 001, and hard base 001. These names have to be exactly as they are written inside your copy paste folder. They can literally be named whatever you want, but it has to be written out exactly as you see it inside the copy paste folder. So if for whatever reason you have spaces in those names, let's say one of your base names looks like this, you would have to put this inside of quotations like this. That's the only way that the plugin is going to recognize that entire name as the file name that is supposed to be used. So to make this simpler, I just try to make it so that all of my file names don't have any spaces in it. If you've ever watched any of my videos previously, you know that I harp on you guys really hard about not having spaces in folder names. This is the same concept. So we'll just put that back. We'll take all the spaces out. This is exactly what it's supposed to look like. All right, so the response from the console is right here. Adding base, easy bases, easy base 001, medium base 001, and hard hard base 001. We're going to see this reflected again once we actually go inside the profiles for each one of these difficulty levels. So now we can do the exact same thing again for medium bases. Therefore, we're going to actually take these file names that we had from easy bases, and we're going to also add this into the medium bases profile. And we're going to get the exact same response again. And I'll do this one more time, and I'll do it for hard bases just like that. And then of course, it's got all those file names that we've now referenced from the copy paste folder. So now, all of this being said, I've had a couple of days to actually wrap my head around what it is that we're actually doing here. So I've now done easy, medium, and hard. If you're going to have all 5 categories of difficulty available on your server, you would then of course want to do the same thing for the expert level as well as for the nightmare level. We're not going to for demonstration purposes, just in the interest of time. I'm already getting into a very long video as it stands. Let's just go forward under the premise that we're only going to be using 3 different difficulty levels, but know that there are 5 different difficulty levels available for you to use. If you actually want to see a list of what your bases now look like and what categories they're in, so that you can confirm that the right base is in the right category, you can do rb.config space list, just like as you see it written on my console right now. So this is going to spit out a big document that has a bunch of extra information in there that I'm going to show you how to remove it, because I feel that it's not necessary for it to be there. So starting right here, this is the command that we just put in, rb config list, and it breaks it down into the different categories. So we've got easy bases right here, and it's going to show down here as additional bases. This is what we have in our easy category. Now these lists are all in alphabetical order. They're not listed in order of difficulty, so remember that. So we've got easy bases at the top, and then the second category is the expert level, so don't get mixed up there. So expert level, these are all placeholder names. These aren't actual real files, unless of course you go through and rename some of your copy paste files to match up with these. They're not actually going to do anything, and you can use a similar command to actually remove these out of the configuration file. I'll show you what I mean, because I'm actually going to show you how to do that. So let's go down to the hard section. So here we are. This is the hard bases section right here. So again, we've got a bunch of files in there that don't make any sense. They don't actually link to anything, but you can see the 3 that I've now added at the bottom of the list. Same thing goes with the medium section. Again, a bunch of names that don't mean anything, but we have these ones down here that we have actually added in. So if you have a look at my easy bases section, you're going to see that I only have 3 file names in there. I don't have this other stuff in there as well. That's because I've already gone through and removed those file names out of my data file. So I'll bring your attention to right here. So the nightmare bases section starts right here, and we've got all of these extra file names again that aren't linked to anything. So let's actually remove that information so that it's not confusing and it doesn't get in the way, because this is already complicated enough. But I do appreciate the fact that NivX put that information in there, because we can use it as a placeholder for the actual bases that we are adding in. So rb.config remove from the nightmare bases profile or category or difficulty level, and then which file names do we actually want to remove from that profile. So now it's responded saying that it has removed those bases that we didn't want in there, and we can do rb.config list. And as you can see there, so interesting side effect that I did not expect. So you're actually seeing my reaction to this live. I did not expect to see this happening. So I removed all 5 of the placeholder file names that NivX has put into the nightmare category for us, and it actually removed the nightmare category out of the list altogether. So you don't see it at the bottom here. This bottom section used to be nightmare category. There's no mention of nightmare anymore. So I'm going to actually do the exact same thing with the expert bases, which is the level 4 difficulty, and see if it removes that expert section altogether. And then later we're going to actually see if this causes us some issues. So fingers crossed that it actually doesn't. All right, so same thing as before. We did rb.config space remove. We're dealing with the expert bases category, and then these are all the expert base file names that again aren't linked to anything. So we're actually going to remove this out of our config altogether. And of course we get a similar response saying that yes, we've removed these file names from the expert category. So let's do rb.config space list again, and to no surprise, it actually removed that category altogether. It's funny, I just had a random player join this server. There's nothing for him to do, but he's playing it. That's cool. FCF Steve, if you're watching this, I noticed you joined the server. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and remove these. I'm gonna edit this part out so that you guys don't have to actually watch me do this again 2 more times, but I'm gonna remove these extra file names out of here, the medium and the hard bases file names that aren't actually associated to anything. Okay, so now that I have all of those file names cleaned up out of there, this actually makes it look a little bit better and maybe a little bit easier to read, especially if you were using different names compared to what I'm using right now. So under the easy bases section, we have easy base 1, medium base 1, hard base 1. Under the hard bases section, we've got easy base 1, medium base 1, hard base 1, and same thing goes for the medium base category. So now it looks way cleaner. It's not such a gigantic document that you see printed out on your screen. It makes it a little bit easier for you to navigate around. So basically what this is we have now told the plugin that these are the file names that we want to spawn in as random bases. And then one of the last things that we actually need to do is we need to actually populate all of the loot information for all of our different difficulty levels of Raidable Bases. And the command to do that is rb.populate. Now you can populate the loot information for each individual difficulty level, or you can just populate everything that is required for everything all at once. So if you wanted to do it by each individual category, you would go rb.populate, and then whatever difficulty level you wanted to populate the information for. Easy is 0, medium is 1, hard is 2, so on and so forth, all the way up to nightmare. But instead of doing that, let's just do rb populate space all, and that's going to generate all of the information that we need for all of the 5 categories of difficulty. And it reports back saying that we've now saved a file to the different loot categories for easy, medium, hard, expert, and nightmare. It has also generated us a default loot configuration table. Don't worry, I understand it. None of this is actually making sense yet until you actually physically see what we've now generated. So now, technically in my mind, we've dealt with all of the difficult aspects of Raidable Bases. The next section we're getting into is dealing with each individual difficulty level and how that event is actually going to spawn on the server. So if we go into our file manager and then into our data folder, you're going to see a Raidable Bases folder right here. Now this is where you're going to do a majority of your work going forward. In fact, it's fair to say that this is the only place that you're going to go to unless you're fine-tuning the main configuration file. This is where you're going to do a majority of your work. Now I feel that this is where most people get screwed up. So one of the biggest concerns that I get about Raidable Bases is that the base spawns fine, but there's no loot inside of it. And the reasoning for that is because you can't just plug this plugin in and expect it to work. Like I said at the very beginning, you have quite a bit of work that you have to do in order for it to function properly. So if we go into base loot and let's just open up the easy bases configuration data file, you'll notice that it's an empty file. That's okay. It's supposed to be empty. The same thing could be said about every difficulty level. This is expert, this is hard, they're all empty. So there's no loot table for the plugin to actually be pulling from. Okay, so for right now, let's just forget about loot. Let's just not worry about the loot tables for each individual difficulty level of Raidable Bases. First of all, let's go into the profiles section so that I can explain to you what's going on in there. So we'll just go into the profiles folder, and this is what we're going to see. So we're going to see all of the different difficulty levels, but this is where the configuration actually happens for each difficulty level. So let's just go into easy bases and have a look at what's in there. Okay, so this is our easy bases profile data file. So, and I'm noticing something different right off the bat that is different from during the testing that I've done all week on this plugin. Before, this was automatically generating at level 0, which is easy. So I'm just going to change this to 0 manually, and hopefully this is going to work. So if you're noticing anything there in the easy bases profile data file, you want to make sure that that is set to 0. When I was going through my testing, this automatically generated at 0. So I'm not really sure what's going to happen. So let's play it out and see how this goes. So the next thing down below that, you're going to start to see the file names that we introduced earlier from our console when I was using the command rb.config add, and then the category easy bases, and then the different file names that I wanted added to this profile. So you can see easy bases 001, you're going to see medium base 001, and then you should see hard base 001. So now by default, you're going to see all of those file names here that we didn't have anything associated to that I actually went through and removed. So if mine looks vastly different from yours, you would see those unassociated file names first before these ones that you've now added in there. And then we start getting into the paste options. So when we start calling on copy paste, how do we actually want that to function? Do we want to stack walls? How many walls do we want to put around it, etc., etc.? You can go through this section right here and decide what works best for you. I'm just going to change this to ice walls. I'm going to make stone walls false, and I'm going to make ice walls true. So the plugin is going to use ice walls instead of stone walls wrapping around my base for easy level only. Next, we get into the NPCs that are guarding our Raidable Bases, what they're wearing, their difficulty levels, etc., etc. Same thing with scientists, murderers. We can control all of this information in regards to what the defenders are actually wearing, what they have on them for loot, and all that stuff. We can control at what health they spawn in at. We can control how many of them there are. We can also decide what type of defenders we want to use. So do we want to use murderers? Change that to true. Do we want to use random amount? Change that to true. Do we want to use scientist only? Change that to true. You get to control exactly how this all functions as far as the NPCs goes. The next is the reward section. So how do we want to reward a player for having a successful raid? If we have economics or server rewards running on our server, we can determine how much cash we want to give them or how many RP we want to give them for a successful raid. So now this is an interesting section right here. So we can actually make it so that the plugin will change the building material of the actual base. So as you saw in my preview very much earlier in this video, you saw that I had a wood base, a stone base, and a metal base, but we can actually make the plugin change those building materials for us. So let's say on the easy level bases, we want to change everything to wood. So even though I built the second base out of stone and the third base out of metal, the plugin is automatically going to switch that building material back to wood. And the rest of this is just basically how the base is going to spawn, how all of the functionality is going to work. Do we want to allow PvP at this base? True or false? Turret health default is at 1000. You can change that to whatever you want it to be. Flame turret health, etc., etc. This section right here, divide loot into all containers. So this is going to depend on how you build the bases. So if you build a bunch of bases that have multiple loot rooms and multiple boxes in each one of those loot rooms, do you want to divide your loot table into each and every single one of those boxes? So if you only have a really small loot table that we're going to pull from, like by default this is set to 6, I believe. We're going to get to that in just a second, but by default the easy level is set to 6. So if we divide the loot across all of the containers inside of the base, and you have, let's say, 12 boxes inside of that base, you might end up with one item per box and nothing in all of the other ones. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. I'm just saying that's what this functionality is going to do. Do you want to divide the loot from the loot table into all of the boxes that's inside the base, or do you want to just leave it at one? If you want all of your loot to spawn in one container, you would change this to false, which that's what we're going to do. This next section here is quite important too. So depending on how you're building your bases, and if you're downloading your bases from the Steam Workshop, you might find that there's actually loot inside of those bases already. So do we want the plugin to empty all of the loot containers before it starts populating the loot that we are now defining? If you want that to happen, change this toggle to true. Therefore, the plugin will empty all of the loot before it starts populating the loot that you've defined. So that's the basic points that I need you guys to pay attention to. Of course, you want to look at every individual line on this profile, because there's a lot of different features that you can turn on and turn off. Going back just up above the turret section, I almost skipped right over this section. So this line right here is where you get to tell the plugin how many items for this difficulty level, which in this case is easy level, how many items do you want the plugin to spawn from the loot table into your loot containers inside your base. Like I said before, this is default set to 6. That is not nearly enough for demonstration purposes. So let's make this 600 items, for example. And I'm going to say that that's enough coverage of this profile data file. So I'm just going to save this up here real quick, and then let's go back to the profile. So what you just watched me do on the easy basis profile is exactly the same thing that you're going to do for all of the different difficulty levels of bases that you want to use on your server. So in our case, we have easy, medium, and hard. We're not doing anything with expert or nightmare level. If you are actually using all 5 different difficulty levels, you would have to go into the profile for that difficulty level and make those changes like I just did on the easy level. I'm not going to do that on screen for you guys right now because it literally looks exactly the same as what I just did. The things that might change in each different difficulty level is how many items you want to spawn in there for loot, how many defenders you might want to spawn, what they're wearing, what kind of weapons they have, etc., etc. You might want to be increasing those things for the increased difficulty level of your bases. Okay, so going back to the Raidable Bases data folder, now it's time to start dealing with our loot tables, because like I said before, we don't have any loot tables built. We do have the one down here at the bottom, the default loot, which is actually technically, I guess, a loot table. So the plugin will default pick from this loot table that we currently have right here. So let's just have a look. So we've got pistol, we've got some basic items in there. This is not a very long loot table. I want to say maybe there might be 20 or 25 items on this loot table. But so the plugin is automatically going to pick items from this loot table on any difficulty level of Raidable Base that spawns. We can of course go in and control how much of each one of these items will spawn in, but you can decide what's going to work on your server. What we want to deal with right now is the actual base loot. So like the loot that's going to spawn on each difficulty level. So this folder right here called editable lists is only for you to create your loot tables with. The plugin doesn't actually use any of these files. It does generate them for you though. So if we go into editable lists and we go into the easy category, you will see that this file has generated every single item in the game with a value of 0. So what Nivex recommends that we do is we actually edit this file right here and then move it into the category that we want it to actually be in. So obviously I'm not going to do that on this video, but just know that the editable lists category is where you want to actually do your work when you're editing your loot tables. And then you want to transfer that file into the appropriate category. So let's just say, just for testing purposes, so I just want to create something that you can obviously see that I've made a change to. So let's find the wood on this editable list. And let's just change this to a minimum amount of 10,000 wood to a maximum amount of 25,000 wood. So that's the only variable that I'm changing in this loot configuration file is the wood. So the only thing that it should generate aside from what's coming from the default loot table is wood. Everything else on this list is still set to zeros. So we're going to save that. And then we're going to copy this entire document and we're going to take it into the Raidable Bases folder. And then we're going to go into base loot, into the easybases.json. That's the loot file for the easy bases. And then we're just going to paste the entire document from the editable list into our actual base loot folder. And we can save this. And now we can finally reload the plugin. And then we can go in game and actually test this out. So if you remember from my configuration setups, I've told the plugin to spawn a base in between every 30 and 60 seconds. So it shouldn't take us very long before we start seeing bases popping up all over the map. All right, so as you can see there, we have a base that has spawned in E9. Let's have a look at our map, and there we go. That's what it looks like at E9. And you can see there it's got the vending machine icon, which is circled around by green, which is indicating that this is an easy level base. So let's go over there and have a look. As I'm flying up to it, you can see that it actually has a dome around it. And as we get closer, you'll see that it has walls built up, and they should be ice walls if I did everything correctly. There we go. We've got ice walls, and we've got a couple of NPCs in there that are ready to defend our base. And if you remember back from the beginning of the video, this was actually a metal base. So the plugin has actually converted this into a wooden level base because it's an easy difficulty level base. So in theory, we should be able to go through here and we can check out our loot. And I'm just going to destroy these doors. Okay, so I found the one container that has loot in it because I told the plugin to not divide all of the loot amongst all of the different containers for the profile easy bases, because that's the only profile that I did any work on. But what I am actually surprised to find is that it didn't populate any wood. So the loot that you're seeing on my screen right now is simply from that default loot table. Okay, so I actually mixed something up in my head, and I'm actually glad that I caught it, even though I caught it while I was recording this video, but that's okay. Gotta love editors. So what I did is I actually put that loot table into the base loot for easy bases. And what I should have done is put it into the difficulty loot for easy bases. So all I did is I went and grabbed that file and I copied it into the difficulty folder instead of the base loot folder. And I do know that there is a priority level that we can set for which loot table is going to get generated or loot pulled from first. And I didn't realize that it was going to be difficulty level over base loot level. That part's a little bit confusing for me right now, and I'm a little bit embarrassed that I just said that on video. So Nivex, maybe you can shoot me a message. Hopefully you're still watching this video at this point in time, and hopefully you can explain to me and my viewers why it's pulling from the difficulty loot table versus the base loot table first. I'm sure this is something that we went over during our call the other night. However, my brain is fried right now with all of this information that I'm trying to get across on this video. So if we go into the loot that was actually generated on this random base, which is a different one from the E9 that I was showing you earlier, you can see that it's still pulled from the default loot table, but now you can see that it actually has the wood in there. So it's got 13,445 wood, which I know is from the loot table that I created because none of those numbers were that high, and everything else is just pulling from the default loot table. Let me just go zip over here real quick to this other base. Oh, it's even the same base that we initially started out with. That's cool. Let's get rid of these doors. Let's look for the loot container, and there we go. There's our loot container. So now this one has, again, same thing as before. It pulled a bunch of stuff off of the default loot table, which of course you can change up. You don't have to leave this stuff on the default loot table if you don't want to. If you don't want to give a C4 for every time somebody raids an easy level base, you want to make sure that you remove that off of the default loot table. The defining characteristic here is this stack of wood right there. That's how you know that it's pulling from the loot table that I created, which only had one item on it, but it was just so that I could show that it was actually pulling information from that loot table. So you remember earlier when I was talking about the dividing the loot over the different loot containers, and you could set that true or false. So this is set at false, therefore it's making all of the loot going into one container. If we set that to true, it would of course divide, you know, 1 or 2 items into each individual loot container. In the example of this base right here, we've got 12 different loot containers that it could go into. Plus, if we told the plugin to make it so that it put all of the resources into the TC, then there would be the TC container as well. And then there would be resources in here. Oh, that brings me to another point. Do you have to put resources inside the TC? No, you don't have to stock the TC. So when you're building these bases and then copying them using copy paste, the question quite often comes up is, do you have to put resources in the TC? No, you don't. The plugin makes it so that this building will not decay until after it's raided. I was kind of hoping the in-game map was going to have like chickenpox all over it, but apparently it's starting. So we've got 7 bases up here in the north, and this is what they all look like here right there. And it just so happens that these are all spawning the exact same base. So 1, 2, 3 of the same base, and then we've got another design right here, and then the third design right there. So as you can see, the plugin is doing exactly what I'm expecting it to do. It's dropping our different levels of bases that we built. These ones all happen to be easy level bases, so the plugin is converting all of the building materials into wood instead of the stone and metal that some of these bases were built in. It's populating the loot from the default loot table, as well as the loot table that I built in the editable lists folder, and then transferred over into the base loot folder, and then later into the difficulty folder, because I didn't realize that it was pulling from the difficulty loot folder first before it was pulling from the base loot folder. They're just popping up all over the place here. So the plugin will continuously spawn bases until it gets to the count of 100 that I defined in the configuration file. So every 30 to 60 seconds, it's going to spawn a new base, and my map is going to start looking like it has some sort of sickly disease. So this plugin is incredibly intuitive. It is very complicated to set up. There's a lot of steps that you have to do, and you're going to miss stuff, and you're going to make some mistakes. Nivex suggests that you go through the documentation, go slowly, do all of the steps that are necessary, get comfortable with it. I've been doing this for a really long time, and even I struggled with this plugin. Even as you saw it on this video, I was struggling with it. I didn't know where to put different loot tables in order to make them function the way that I wanted them to. So go slow, don't get frustrated, read the documentation, just do the steps that are necessary to make it happen. I've given you the basics of bringing your bases into the plugin so the plugin knows which bases to use. I've shown you how to create loot tables. When you populate your loot tables from the very beginning, they all come in at zeros. You want to work on your different levels of loot tables inside the editable lists folder, and then transfer it into the appropriate folder after that, and then reload the plugin, and then it's going to start pulling loot information from those loot tables that you've moved in there. Don't get overwhelmed by this. When you see this data folder, it looks like a lot of information, but if you break it down actually into individual folders, it's not that big a deal. I didn't even touch on the weekday loot, but you can do the exact same thing. So you go into your editable lists, you create your loot table in there, and then you transfer that information into your weekday folder. If you set up your initial configuration so that you had different loot tables for different days of the week. This is the default loot table that I was talking about. This is what generated most of what you saw in those loot containers. Aside from the wood, of course, everything else was pulled from this default loot table right here. So this default loot table is going to apply to every difficulty level of base that spawns on your server. It's only the individual loot tables that you've created for your difficulty levels that's going to define which loot is going to spawn based on the difficulty level of the base that spawned. I have the Herculean task of editing about 4 hours worth of footage down into a reasonable amount of time and still get a respectable amount of information across to you guys in this video form. I fully expect that my comment section is going to explode with comments, with people having questions and problems, and I'm also hoping that somebody can clarify the difference between base loot and difficulty loot, because my brain right now is not working the way that I think that it should be, so I can't differentiate between the two. So I just ended up putting that loot table into both of those folders for the easy difficulty level. I'm sure there's a reason why that's not the case. I just can't wrap my head around it right this very second. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope this helps some of you at least. I know that not everyone is going to like this video. I fully understand that, and I'm fully expecting it. Make sure you leave your comment in the comment section down below so that I know how you guys are feeling. You can of course reach out to me on my Discord or in the comment section down below. If you guys are still with me at this stage of the video, I appreciate you watching the entire video. I hope to see you guys again next week. Make sure you leave a like on the video. Take care of yourselves and each other, and I'll see you guys next Friday.